Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I am doing this video just before club starts, so I'm trying to get a few minutes of time to be able to share some content about oligopolies that perhaps didn't come up in our discussions. This would be only extra credit for anyone who's taking the quiz, whether you're taking the oligopoly quiz on Thursday before break or Monday after break. One thing we do know about oligopolies is that we tend to use game theory when oligopolists are competing because they use strategic decision making. They have to worry about the other firm. Also, they're going to be making informed decisions based on their best strategies. Firms always have a best strategy in light of what the other firm is doing, whether this is going to create a dominant strategy or whether this is going to lead them to a Nash equilibrium or equilibria. That's something that we talked about with game theory. Also keep in mind oligopolies do have a tendency to want to collude because it can help them join and gain profit. But of course, collusion in the U.S. is illegal. There will be a couple of things that we'll note about that in this video. Collusion is the act of cooperation, basically trying to work together to form essentially what would be a monopoly, using the monopoly price and producing the monopoly quantity, and then splitting the quantity. Two firms might decide to each take 50% of a market and then set the price really high and then share some of the revenues. That would not be unheard of course. Again, it's illegal. So you're given that in an example on an AP quiz, know that it's something that's illegal in the United States. Collusion does, however, result in the incentive to cheat. Oftentimes where firms might collude is not necessarily the Nash equilibrium, and if it is not, there's a likelihood that collusion might offer one firm to kind of backstab another. That's not uncommon. There are a few types of oligopolies. One thing that we can certainly talk about is this notion of price leadership. We're not going to graph this. I'm just going to mention it. Sometimes there is something called tacit collusion. This is collusion that would be a little bit harder for authorities, antitrust authorities to pick up on. Price leadership would be an agreement maybe between a group of firms where one firm might first raise prices and other firms would then follow. For example, we know that the automobile industry tends to come out with their new prices and their new cars somewhere around October or so. So it's not atypical for one firm to kind of lead what the new prices are going to be and other firms kind of follow so that they're a little bit related. That would be probably a form of like tacit collusion. How much that might be something that's illegal, if it's not something that's jointly defined, it kind of runs a little bit of that middle road. Colluding oligopolies, of course, would graph very similar to a monopoly. Let me give you two practice problems. If you're interested in the extra credit, I'll give you two practice problems to consider, and you can do that for extra credit, or I'll give you at least one that you can consider. And then for a non-colluding oligopoly, there's a few different formats. One that we're going to take a look at is the Kinked demand curve. It happens to also be in Chapter 13, so you might see it there. Price leadership, we don't really need a graph. Firms can't formally fix prices, but using signaling, you might get a price change. Other firms follow the leader. I don't think you need more information about this. Of course, if price leadership were to break down, oligopolies can also find themselves in a price war where they're looking to lower the price and lower the price and lower the price up until a point where everybody loses, right? So price increases can sometimes lead to undercutting one's opponent, which then leads to a price war and downward spiral because everybody gets less revenue. Colluding oligopolies are going to operate in the format of a cartel. It's generally an agreement which sets price and output, some type of agreement. We call it generally a cartel. You could call this a contract, an agreement, in some cases an understanding, right? firms would require generally similar demand and similar cost curves in order to really merge together and operate as a monopoly. Maybe two steel companies that are producing a good that's fairly homogeneous and has very, very similar production and similar demand would make sense. Cartels generally have to have a way to punish cheaters, for those companies that break the agreement. Otherwise, it's very much the case that likely companies will break the agreement, especially if there is a Nash equilibrium that's elsewhere on the payoff matrix. Together, of course, they act as a monopoly. Here's our monopoly graph. They act as a monopoly, and they would just share the profit. So, that's essentially what happens there. And, the details of a question might give you an understanding of how they would share the monopoly profit, okay? Non-colluding oligopolies, this is the last thing. Let's assume that we have 4 gas stations on a corner, and, one of these gas stations, let's say maybe we have, an interest in maximizing the profit, right? So let's say that, Patrick is one of the kids who is creating a new gas station, new business person creating a new gas station and trying to compete with these other gas stations. And there's a question of how Patrick can maximize profit when these other competitors are so close, right? So we might use the kinked demand curve model. These are non-collusive firms, and we have kind of 2 options, okay? One is if Patrick's firm cuts its prices, then other firms might also match that price. Because if Patrick cuts his price thinking, I'm going to get all of the market, everybody's going to come to my gas station, that sounds good for like 2 hours until the other firms also cut their prices, and then everybody is seeing a lower price, and we also have largely inelastic demand. You have cut your price, Patrick, and now you're finding your total revenue to be decreasing, right? This would be inelastic demand. The other alternative is other firms could ignore the change. So say that Patrick decides, I'm going to raise the price. Like, I'm going to raise the price to try to get more profit. Other firms would ignore the change, and everybody's going to leave Patrick's gas station and go someplace else. So Patrick is kind of, it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you cut your prices, everybody else just cuts their prices and everybody makes less. If you raise your prices thinking that you're going to get more profit because you have more revenue, you're basically going to lose your customers, and everybody else is going to maintain the same price, steal your customers, and you will have elastic demand. We get a graph that looks something like this. We have a demand curve that literally has a kink in it. If the price is $4, and that's what Patrick's gas is going for, when he increases the price, what happens? He will see very, very few customers. He will lose like 40 of his customers to his competitors, right? He raised his price to $4.50. If he lowers his price, from $4 to $3.50, he is going to see some more revenue, right? But now everybody he's not going to see more revenue, because even though a few more people are interested in buying the gas, his price is a lot lower, and he's got inelastic demand, okay? And everybody else will also lower their price. So he's really not going to capture the whole rest of the market, unfortunately, just a little bit. So his quantity's increasing, but not increasing enough, okay? So if we look at this as an example, you can actually see what happens for somebody who's operating in a kinked demand. You have 2 MR curves. This is essentially like 2 demand curves put together, right? You have a demand curve that's very flat on the top here, this demand curve, and then you have a demand curve that's inelastic, and they're intersecting, right? So we have kinked demand curve, and as a result, we really have 2 marginal revenue curves. We're just not extrapolating all of them, but we've got these marginal revenue curves and some space in the middle, right, where there is no marginal revenue curve, right? It just doesn't quite intersect. So you've got these marginal revenue curves and these and the demand curves, and of course the marginal cost curve. The big takeaway here is we tend to see prices become very sticky in a kink demand situation, because for the most part, you don't want to raise your price and you don't want to lower your price, so you're just going to stick with the same price, and everybody else is going to do the exact same thing. So you see lots of companies, very close together, all with the exact same price, and it kind of makes us wonder why it isn't somehow different, but these are the reasons why that's the case. We also see that even if marginal costs were to increase a little bit, we don't tend to have a lot of changes in the quantity that would be produced. The quantity that would be produced is where MR equals MC, and we're just going to kind of draw a little dotted line and have that dotted line serve as part of our MR curve, right? So at a variety of different prices, we don't have any different quantity, and really at a variety of different costs, when the cost curve increases or decreases, we don't really see a lot of shifts in quantity. So again, this tends to be a price and quantity that are going to be very, very sticky, okay? And you have essentially the kink demand curve, okay? I'm going to leave it there. Be well, everyone. I will see you soon.